The museum building is very much an architectural statement. If you think about its location within the university, the nearest building is the old library. And the old library has the long room, which is an astonishing space. And I think with the museum building, this devotion of vast amount of space to aesthetic purpose, basically, is a statement. It's a great, grand aesthetic statement. Also, Dean and Woodward were looking to architecture in London. They were looking to the work of Sir Charles Barry in London, and he would have used very grandiose staircases. So Sir Charles Barry designed the House of Parliament in London, Westminster Palace. He designed various clubs in London, and that kind of grandiose entrance was part of that whole Italianate 19th century aesthetic. So I think that also, of course, the ventilation system, because it's a container of air. So there was a practical element as well, but there's too much focus on pure architecture in there for it to be anything other than a great statement. If you think about the Berkeley Library, which is built later in between the old library and the museum building, and you go up to the upper floor of the Berkeley Library and you look at the Morrison Reading Room, gigantic and wonderful waste of space in there as well. And the architects there in the 1960s inserting a building between the old library and the museum building, where architects think about what went before and what they're up against. So I think that Dean and Woodward certainly would have been very conscious that they were making a building that was very different to any other building in Trinity College, and they were looking at grand classical buildings with great spaces. So the long room, the public theatre or exam hall, the chapel, you know, they're all extremely grand. They had to find space for the extension to the library, so it had to be attached to the old library. And the podium between the museum building and the old library is a building in itself. It's now going to become part of the Trinity visitor experience for the Book of Kells. I mean, it goes way down into the earth. So the podium, which creates a kind of new piazza within the university, is a building. And that is the link from the old library to the new library. And then, of course, they had the space behind the Berkeley Library to extend and make the Usher Library. So it was the logical place to put the new building. University Church on St. Stephen's Green. It's the chapel of the Catholic University of Ireland, and it was built in the mid to late 1850s, so it's roughly contemporary with the museum building. Trinity College was the only University of Ireland in the 18th century, and in the 19th century you have the founding of a Catholic university in 1854 on St. Stephen's Green. And they build a little chapel beside the Georgian house in which the new university is housed. It's got a beautiful brick front to St. Stephen's Green. It's the most coveted wedding venue in the city. And the architect of that was a man called John Hungerford Pollen, who was appointed as the professor of architecture in this new university, and he designed this chapel. And he would have known Dean and Woodward, and he would have known what was happening at the museum building. And the walls of the chapel are lined in Irish marble, or rather Irish limestones polished up to look like marble. There's only one actual marble in Ireland, and that's the green Connemara marble. So that church is really comparable to the museum building. There's one other interior of interest, which is number 51 St. Stephen's Green, which was the Museum of Irish Industry, and it's on the east side of St. Stephen's Green. And an architect called George Wilkinson owned a collection. It's really interesting, a collection of examples of Irish stone. Cork red, marble, as they call it. These are limestones that are polished up. Kilkenny marble is a limestone which polishes up to black and is called marble. And if you go into the lobby, the vestibule of number 51 St Stephen's Green, the Museum of Irish Industry is long gone, but the vestibule survives. And in the vestibule, and this is 1850s as well, you have panels of marble which belonged to George Wilkinson, and they've got the source. It tells you precisely where they came from. So the same taste, the interest in geology and in specific geology of Ireland is evident in those three different places. The museum building, of course, is really the most spectacular example of it. And the Connemara marble, the green marble, is used to brilliant effect, because when you go in and you look at the stair, and with the central flight and the two flights that go up, if you look at the handrail, the entire handrail is made of green Connemara marble. And then, if you go into you'll see that there's a display there which gives you the source of all the various types of stone from Cork, from Kilkenny, from different parts of Ireland, which are used in the building. Also, the wall, the actual walling, which now has worn, it's slightly grey, beautifully grey, I think. I don't think they should touch it. But it was originally a creamy colour, so you have to imagine when you went into that space that it was cream, not grey. And this was a stone from France called Ken stone. It's a very soft stone that's easily worked. So you had a mixture of local material and imported materials, but predominantly this interest in using native stone. Yes, it does. Irish architects were really in awe of the museum building, because it was the first example of its kind of this Venetian or Lombard Gothic architecture. And I think it was Sir Thomas Drew said of it that it was the catalyst to a whole new way of making buildings. So if you walk out the front gate of Trinity and you walk up Dame Street, you will see quite a number of buildings that actually derive stylistically from the museum building. And beside the central bank, on the right-hand side, there at Fowne Street with the wonderful little windows going up the stair, that was the Crown Insurance building, and that is directly indebted to the museum building. The Scottish Widows, which was also an insurance building just out on College Street, it's a big red sandstone building, also indebted to the museum building. And further up Dame Street there are banks which also look to the museum building. So this style was exotic, it was new. There's a wine and tea merchants on Westmoreland Street. The people standing for the bus will be standing beside this, and you can see the wine and tea merchant, and it's all got little round arches. It's brick, it's not beautiful stone, but it's the same style. Obviously, people who are selling wine and tea want something exotic. So I think it appealed commercially, and also it lent itself to ornament. And ornament had wide public appeal. So, and banks wanted to make a grand statement. So there were all sorts of reasons for choosing this, but I think architects played a major role in spreading the stylistic manner of the museum building. It is the first example of a taste which had emerged in Britain in the 1840s, but into the 1850s, and And specifically, it is a reflection of the taste of the greatest aesthetic writer, I think, of the 19th century. And I'm not the only one. I mean, he is the towering figure, and that is John Ruskin. And Ruskin's Stones of Venice, a series of books called The Stones of Venice, the first volume came out in 1851. So that's 2 years before the museum, the beginning of the museum building. And Ruskin actually said that the museum building was the first manifestation of which he had the joy to see of the principles that he had been expounding in the Stones of Venice. And Ruskin was a great admirer of Venetian architecture. He was an artist himself. He drew buildings. He admired decay in buildings. He thought that buildings should be allowed to grow old, that we shouldn't be cleaning them up and polishing them up, that they should have the dignity of age. He encouraged people to watch buildings, sit and watch as the light passed across the building. Probably most importantly, he extolled the virtue of creativity. And he talks about the noble muscular action of the human hand on the material. He advocated creativity, freedom of creativity for craftsmen. So if you look, for example, at the buildings of Front Square, so William Chambers or other architects would design a building, they would design the classical mouldings, and the craftsmen, sculptors, etc., would do what they were told. They would make those mouldings. Ruskin said, go out and look at the medieval cathedrals and all the ugly hobgoblins and all the, gargoyles and gruesome figures, but don't mock them, because he says they are the proof of the freedom of creativity of the craftsman. And he believed that creative freedom ennobled. So he admired Venice. He particularly admired polychromy, colour in buildings. If you think of Front Square again, grey and white, the museum building is startling in the fact that it is the first really, other than, brick that we see in the rubrics, it is a coloured building. Because the building has been recently cleaned, you can see in the roundels just the effect of those very, the green Connemara marble, the red stone, and this all refers to Venetian palaces. Architecture in Ireland, for centuries was achieved by architects who are not born in Ireland. So William Chambers, who designed the exam hall and the public theatre, is not an Irish architect. Edward Lovett Pearce, who made the Parliament House, not an Irish architect. Thomas Burr, who did the old library, was born in Ireland. But, there were more foreign architects working and making buildings in Ireland or sending designs to Ireland in the 18th century than there were native architects. There is a case made about the museum building. Why is it that the first example of Ruskin's thinking should happen in Ireland? Why is it that the O'Sheas are given this freedom here in Ireland? And there's a scholar called Brian Hanson who writes about architects and the building industry. And he argues that in Ireland in the 18th century, so, 100 years before the museum building, you had a burgeoning building industry, say in Dublin. Builders were making houses and decorating them, and they had a lot of autonomy. So what you get in Dublin, you don't see it on the streets, but it's there behind the bare brick fronts, is very exuberant plasterwork, immensely free, virtuoso, idiosyncratic, with the kind of freedom that Ruskin was talking about in the 19th century. So Hanson argues that in Ireland there was actually a tradition of giving a certain amount of autonomy to craftsmen. James Gandon thought that his sculptor, Edward Smith, at the Custom House was as good as Michelangelo, and he let him, the wonderful keystones that he made there. So it is arguable that there was something about Ireland that produced this really remarkable an exemplary building in Dublin in the 1850s. The campus is obviously something that develops over time. It's based on a series of squares. So you have Front Square, behind it you have Library Square, you have Fellows Square, and then you have New Square. And New Square, which is not new now, but was new in the 1830s when it was given its name. And the museum building was the last building to close New Square. It was very different to everything that went before it. It hasn't got a parapet. You can see the roof, you can see the chimneys, it's ornamental, it's coloured. But it is also very well behaved. It is a box that defines a square. And then when the Berkeley Library is added, it too is a box that defines a square or a piazza between the museum building and the old library. So there is amazing continuity in terms of the gridded system, the creation of squares or piazzas, the quality of the design throughout from the 18th century into the 19th century, and the quality of materials. Because West Front, you know, is Irish granite, Portland stone, Front Square, Irish granite, Portland stone. The museum building is Irish granite, Portland stone outside with coloured dressings, and then inside all these wonderful materials. So there is continuity in terms of the quality of design and materials.